In so many ways, tonight's keynote speaker epitomizes the theme of this conference, research, practice, and place. His research actually, more accurately, his scholarship takes two forms. First, in Donald Shawn's terms, Laurie Olin is a reflective practitioner. He writes and presents ideas generated from his practice. Second, he draws. He draws very well, and his drawings are close studies, really visual research of places. Laurie Olin is an important landscape architecture practitioner, one of the most important, if not the most important of his generation. One feature of his vast body of works is his collaborations with leading architects, most notably Harry Cobb and Peter Eisenman, Frank Gehry, and currently Karen Timberlake. Laurie Olin was educated as an architect himself, which may explain the ease and the depth of his collaborations with architects. In the tradition of Frederick Law Olmsted, Laurie Olin is a placemaker and a student of places. His transition from architect to landscape architect evolved from his sketching the English countryside as a Guggenheim Fellow, and then on to the Italian city when he was a Rome Prize recipient. He combines his scholarship, practice, and understanding of place to his teaching. He's taught in various places. He was served as our Ruth Carter Stevenson Chair here in Austin and has held teaching positions at the University of Pennsylvania and Harvard. He is current professor of practice at Penn. So please join me in welcoming Laurie Olin.
Hello, Austin, as they say. In a way, Fritz just gave a summary of some of the things I hope to cover. The triad that we're all being asked to consider at this conference, research, practice, and place, is a very powerful one that anyone, whether they're a practitioner or an academic, if they're interested in advancing the fields of architecture or landscape architecture, planning, or urban design, or preservation, we have to take these three topics very seriously. And additionally, it's important that we ensure their strong interrelationship for any successful advancement of the fields that we're interested in. So I think the topics are particularly meaningful to me because I've devoted my life and my career to them. I have, however, added a rather large postscript at the end of this little talk on another topic that they lead to, which is something you all know probably, if anything, more than I do about, and that is a little bit about teaching. So let's talk about the varieties of research. We generally think of research as consisting of three types: scientific research, humanities research, and artistic research. Now, each one has its habits and their achievements, their limitations. And in academia and the great research universities in America, it's been my experience to note that many of those who are engaged in each of these important aspects of human creativity have some skepticism and disdain for the other one, which is actually foolish and needless, but it's there, and we know it. Now, scientific research, I think everyone pretty much understands, is about theories and explanations of nature, its properties and its processes. And, it makes possible all sorts of practical applications. And in the past century, it's become highly dependent upon mathematics and quantitative methods of measurement for its documentation and its verification. Now, some of the work that is most familiar to our fields, your fields, shared, that come from science have to do with energy, with climate, with materials, with structural and topological systems, the various works of applied chemistry, biology, ecology, physics, hydrologic, and the earth sciences. Real science does mean a lot to all of us. Now, humanities research in recent decades has not necessarily searched for or believed in finding any single or supposed correct answers. In fact, it has instead explored issues and details that consider interesting or important questions regarding our social, historical, political, cultural, ethnic, ethical problems. And, architectural history would be an example of research that employs primary resources and evidence. That's an example. So too would be some of the recent work of the, social interaction in particular public settings, such as therapeutic nature of particular environments or gardens upon, people with Alzheimer's or recovering medical patients, things like that. That's this kind of applied humanistic studies and social sciences that we're all quite familiar with. Now, artistic research, also sometimes referred to as practice-based research, which I kind of like the phrase, is probably the least understood of them all. I think it encompasses creative work, both the processes and the result, and it offers alternative results from scientific and humanities research regarding the possible reality and our knowledge of what might be and how we understand things. Artistic research is speculative, not definitive, and it's capable of producing new and previously unanticipated or predictable associations and results. Whether that's in music or theater or poetry, the visual arts, dance, architecture, landscape architecture. And because success is almost exclusively a qualitative one, this is a form of endeavor that, since it is neither quantifiable nor verifiable, most academics in sciences and humanities have a difficult time assessing and understanding it. And some of our colleagues up in College Hall in the President's office, when it comes time for tenure reviews, are quite baffled by this and how to deal with it. And you've all dealt with that, I'm sure. But quite often, some of our colleagues in these other fields, when they're presented with true excellence in artistic research, they can tell that that's excellent. They get that. So now, as Fritz said, at different times in the past 40 years, I personally have engaged in each of the three types of research, either independently as an individual scholar or through the work in our office. And I've watched with great interest and kibitzed with friends and colleagues as they've engaged in one form or another of this sort of research. And most of my independent exploration and study falls into the category of humanities research, and most of the office research falls within the categories either of applied scientific or artistic research. I had the great fortune to be introduced to research as a young person in Alaska, where people studying the geology, the atmosphere, wildlife, permafrost, the old Bering Sea culture, people like all sorts of things like that. These guys were in and out of Fairbanks when I was a child, in and out of our house. And I actually collected fossils, Pleistocene mammals, in the gold fields, working with one of the world's leading paleontologists while I was still in high school. Later, as a young artist and an architect in Seattle, I embarked upon an independent study of Skid Row and the Skid Row community, and I became publicly embroiled in a successful fight to save the Pioneer Square and the Pike Place Market from very disastrous plans for urban renewal that would have demolished large and important historic portions of the city. I moved into an old hotel on Skid Row and had a studio there, and I lived there for a number of months while I was studying the characters that formed the community known as Skid Row. The publication that resulted from this effect had a big effect upon public policy, actually, and some of the things we did, like suing the city and that sort of thing, helped. And one of the things I learned years later at Penn from a cultural anthropologist on the faculty was that that piece of work was considered ethnography, which I did not know at the time. Well, after years of practice in some leading modernist offices and firms in New York and Seattle, I proposed and received, as Fritz said, funding to do some study of the southwest landscape of England. This study I thought should unite both the historic survey and ecology of the land, plus the life and history of it as a cultural landscape, as well as the study of the high art movement of the villas and parks and that sort of thing, which had all been intensely studied by a series of different scholars, but it was always kept absolutely separately. None of them talked to anybody, and no one saw the interrelationships between them. So that's what I did. I worked on that for a while, and eventually it was published by the University of Pennsylvania Press under the title Across the Open Field. This work has really encompassed several years of field observation, long sessions in historic collection of the British Museum, Wiltshire Records Office, Library of Henry Hort, Storehead, along with work at the American Academy in Rome and the Hertziana Library of the Max Planck Institute in Rome. So these are kind of fairly conventional kinds of study, I'd say. And in between these two different projects, I conducted, as Fritz said, a form of very personal research in the form of field observation and study, where I spent a concentrated time immersing myself in the natural world of the Pacific Northwest, largely out in it, quietly, patiently, day after day, examining and recording aspects, largely in the form of drawing, but sometimes to the extent of actually standing in the base of waterfalls or out in places, drawing and sort of feeling and trying to understand what it was that the phenomena that I was involved in. Now, a lot of what I know and have been able to apply in our design practice and teaching really comes from such personal experiencing in the world. Especially the superb works of great design and of cities. And a lot of what I got out of the world, it turns out that I notice other people also get out of the world. And it's from visiting great and important things and from actually spending time studying them, looking at them. And if you try to draw something, you actually have to see it. You have to sit still. Now, I noticed in the program there's some talk that implies that this might be a passé activity, that, we don't really need to send our young students out to draw old masterpieces from the, dead white men of the European civilization anymore. That actually this is a different time and we learn things in new ways and we transmit information in new ways, and this is passé. But I will point out that these two drawings, the upper one by Alvar Aalto at Delphi and the lower one by Lou Kahn, obviously, at the Acropolis, that an awful lot of people who are better architects than me spent a lot of time doing exactly that, trying to understand what makes great works tick, sitting still and spending time with them. I've been sketching and drawing, as Fritz said, for a long time, and I've come to the conclusion that there is such a thing as change and progress, but it's done in our field. There really is no such thing as progress in the arts except in the individual personal development. In other words, each one of us has to try and get back to the same level of heightened awareness of some of the other great people who have been able to produce great work. There's change and evolution, that's true. Now, I've spent many days, many years doing drawings, and there is no substitute for first-hand knowledge for actually experiencing great art and design. Go see beautiful places and profound solutions to urban and social needs and soak them up. I don't think there's any substitute for that. And one of the best methods that has ever been devised, it's worked for 2,000 years, is drawing. The purpose, if you think that the purpose of research is knowledge, that one of the ways we get knowledge if you're in the arts is through your eyes and through your hands and through working and engaging in the world. Anyway, that's enough on that for a minute, but I have very little regard for modern tourism and the ubiquitous, somewhat promiscuous use of photography on the part of all those people who rush about through historic masterpieces of design and architecture, and I'm sure many of you share that. The proliferation of images employed carelessly without understanding or substance is a problem of our time. We're drowning in information and in meaningless representation that's combined with a remarkable lack of comprehension regarding the use of materials, spatial form, quality, the auditory and tactile properties of things and their combinations. Also, I think a lot of people who are spending too much time indoors and not out in the world are also having trouble understanding social behavior and social relations and how people actually use space. Well, because there's exemplary works from all over the world in all cultures, you have to go out and see it, and it's very cumbersome, and it takes a while. But it's incumbent upon people in our field, I believe, to do so and to go take the time and go out and see the world and spend time in it and bring back the news in their own person. I also, as Fritz said, have done some other more conventional scholarship and research. And so a couple of things I've done that I think are the kind of research that we do in our field when we're kind of ticking along and having a good time, is we actually do monographs and we study great works, and then we document it and then we share it with others. These are usually called monographs, that sort of thing. And I've done 2 monographs, co-authored them with other people on historic houses and gardens. This one happens to be La Foce, which I did with a series of friends. It's Iris Arrigo's villa that was one of Cecil Pinson's 2 greatest works done in the 1930s. It happens to be in Tuscany near Montepulciano. And the other was recently was a project I finished a few years ago with Witold Rybczynski, which was about the Villa Vizcaya in Biscayne Bay, which was built by James Deering in Coconut Grove. And it is a truly amazing project in some ways, very odd, but quite wonderful. And we had access to all the original documents, to the design, to all the drawings that survive, the correspondence between Deering and his kind of nutty team that was pulled together by a mad interior designer with a wonderful self-effacing architect and an even more self-effacing landscape architect, Diego Suarez. It's a remarkable story, and it was fun to do. But also, it was like no one even understood how they made it and how it could have come to be. And so producing that book was great fun. Now, I'll touch on some other things. Our involvement in technical and scientific applied science research when I talk about the office. But if we think about the nature of artistic research in our work and that of our peers, I think it's particularly synchronous with other forms of research, particularly scientific research. And despite the seeming lack of quantitative measurements, one familiar definition of research is simply that it is a process of the steps to collect and analyze information to increase understanding of a topic or issue. And it consists of three simple steps. Pose a question, collect or generate some data to answer the question, and present an answer to the question. Now, surely this is what those of us in the arts do all the time. We set ourselves problems or questions, often stimulated by projects presented by our clients, and then we explore various answers to them, through whatever our chosen medium is. No one that I know personally does this more than Frank Gehry, a master at asking himself, what if? Few offices I know resemble a laboratory more than Frank's, where one finds a relentless number of explorations devoted to one problem, building, urban scheme, or situation after another. Model after model, sketch studies in all manners of materials, sizes, forms, and combinations. They fill the tables and benches and pile up in the corners, often beginning as small little doodle-esque 3D cartoons. They grow, they replicate, larger and larger. They're scrapped, they're revised, they're abandoned, they're begun again. The scales vary from bits as small as erasers and paper cups to models that one can climb inside, to full-size mock-ups out in the parking lot. Now, I would say, contrary to popular and uncomprehending chatter and some loose kind of things that people say to each other over drinks, even some professionals I know, that Frank Gehry's work is not whimsical, it's not random, and it is not capricious. But it actually is the result of extraordinarily patient explorations of form and of structure, of space and materials. The cardboard, the foam, the paper, the foil, the plexi, the dowels, the sponge, the screens representing particular materials and understood structural devices in sketch form. Now, while many, like myself, have explored design ideas for millennia through drawing, Frank and his associates sketch and they study primarily with models. And I think most of you are aware of that, but they document them then with digital processes that have been evolving for quite a few years in sophistication and complexity. Now, like Bach's seemingly endless variations and themes, this is a demonstration of artistic research of an intensity and focus most practitioners do not have the creative insight, curiosity, nor stamina or will to sustain. In 8 years that we worked with Frank on the ever-evolving design of the private residence for Peter Lewis in Cleveland, Ohio, 3 photos of which I have here, I watched Frank move in one direction for a time and then in another. It was a fecund period of exploration for him. And what happened was, out of that project, out of the Peter Lewis residence, came large chunks of the museum in Bilbao, a complete redesign, formal direction, change of materials of Disney Hall, and the whole Deutsches Bank project on Pariser Platz in Berlin, plus other odds and ends, all came out of this long R&D thing that Peter let him do at his expense. Thanks to a patron, of course, who didn't really care to build anything, Frank was able to undertake one of the most sustained R&D periods of any architect in our time. It should be clear that in our world, artistic research and practice are virtually inseparable. Well, in my case, the years of travel, study, and explorations and of collaboration practice eventually led me to generate a certain amount of theoretical speculation also about the nature of landscape architecture regarding topics such as form, meaning, and expression, and the relationship of ecological issues to cultural ones. There's a book up there that Fritz was the editor of that a whole bunch of us delivered papers in, especially in the context of place and creation of, shall I say, new environments. A considerable proportion of the work of practice, I believe, falls under the heading of applied research. It has led, in our case, in our office, to books like this one by my partner, Susan Weiler, who recently authored this, regarding construction of landscape over structures, or that exhibition and installation at the ICA, Institute of Contemporary Art in Philadelphia, that Peter Eisenman and I did, that documented the several dozen projects we've done. So in practice, one is always out there and you're always doing things, which takes us to practice. Well, if academia can be caricatured as a realm of ideas that help to steer and shape the fields it engages, practice, I think, can be caricatured as the action, the thought, the skills, the work that provides the material for academic study and theory, as well as its purpose. Peter Rowe has succinctly noted that from all perspectives, design appears to be, From all perspectives, design appears to be a fundamental means of inquiry by which man realizes and gives shape to ideas of dwelling and settlement. Furthermore, design is a practical form of inquiry insofar as it is concerned with making a certain commonplace usefulness quite apart from its more esoteric benefits. Well, it is this physical world created from a combination of ideas and building materials through a frequently contentious process of politics, social interaction, financial and legal maneuvers that encompasses professional practice, and which offers materials for the study, the analysis, and criticism by those of our institutions to develop theories that coax, nudge, attack, even suggest alternative or improved directions for further development and experiment in our fields of endeavor. There would be no history, theory, or research if there were no practice. There would be no point. The world of practice, as it has been for centuries, is beset with problems of all scales, purpose, and degree, from the banal and the quotidian to questions of great technical difficulty, as well as of ethical and moral importance. As is common today, our office is full of all this stuff, this junk. It's full of computers, very bright young professionals adept at using them, the many proliferating programs, applications that utilize for design study, modeling, documentation, animation sequences, construction monitoring, communication, bookkeeping. It's got all this stuff. But these are really just apparatus and tools that have supplemented or occasionally replaced other paraphernalia. And although important in our day-to-day activity and a subject matter that a number of us are trying to gain more control over, in part to wrest control of our design, its manufacture, and pricing back from the construction managers who are, with the unwitting aid of the AIA, have had a terrible impact upon our professions. There's a reason why we have to deal with all that stuff. Practice, put simply, is the exercise of performance or skill or of a profession In our case, that of the invention and direction of production of designs of structures of all sorts intended for many purposes. While it may begin in kind of speculation, it's carried out through action. And because of the physical nature of the products of our thought and production and their impact upon the health and welfare of those who come in contact with them, its performance is licensed by the state on a basis of safety. Don Shawn, who Fritz mentioned a minute ago, in his remarkable investigation while he was at MIT into the nature of practice, The Reflective Practitioner was the title of his book, How Professionals Think in Action. That's back in 1983 he wrote, I haven't found a better one yet. Maybe you all know new texts that I should know about, but he addressed the question of the relationship between the kinds of knowledge honored in academia and the kinds of competence that's valued in professional practice. And after discussing the legacy of 19th century German universities and their impact upon American institutions that gave rise to the separation between theoretical and scientific research from that of applied science and instrumental activity, which has led to some of the biases that we all suffer under about higher and more elevated and more prestigious academic work, he moves to the problematic legacy of technical rationality and positivism that came to dominate a number of fields, including the social sciences and most professional schools, with a concomitant pressure being put upon schools that teach architecture to conform to a positivist, technologically rational, research-based paradigm, which in his words, has worked only partially. I agree. In an attempt to explain what actually happens in practice beyond the unspoken assumption that many academics have about practitioners, that there's some kind of refined form of idiot savant, mysterious at times, envious persons of canny knowledge and skills, but of impulse and action, largely inarticulate non-intellectuals, Shawn presents an explanation of what he terms reflection in action. He accepts that to successfully practice architecture, one must know and be able to marshal a large amount of information and interact successfully with others. And when we put it to use, it is an example of knowing in action. He spends a lot of time talking about knowing, what it is to know things. And that we employ this knowing in action, we employ unconsciously every day in very ordinary, but also in special ways. We recognize phenomena, familiar situations, types and problems, behavior, and take action or respond seemingly effortlessly without stopping to figure out or knowing what we're about while we're in the act of doing. It's kind of like basketball, the zen of the shot, You don't think about it, you have to do it, We draw upon our accumulated experience and our knowledge, and we take action. We make decisions, we perform tasks, we write, and we draw something very particular, and we direct others. Well, at times, however, Shawn points out that while in the act of response or work, we pause because something has surprised us or causes us to reflect upon what we're doing and to question why it is different. What am I doing and why? And we ask, what's resulted? We have moved then into what Donald Shawn, refers to as reflection in action. And in this he says, once we put aside the model of technical rationality, which leads us to think of intelligent practice as merely an application of knowledge to instrumental decisions, there's nothing strange about the idea that a kind of knowing is inherent in intelligent action. When someone reflects in action, he becomes a researcher in the practice context. He is not dependent upon the categories of established theory and technique, but constructs new theory of a unique case. Our deliberation is not limited to about which means, no a priori argument about what the ends are. We don't even think like that at that moment. The practitioner at that point doesn't keep means and ends separate, but defines them interactively as they frame problematic situations. He does not separate thinking from doing because his experimenting is a kind of action. Implementation is built into his inquiry. Well, in the course of design inquiry, in practice, there appear to be two important processes. 1. Faced with unique phenomena or similarities perceived, the inquirer draws upon some element of his familiar repertoire, which he treats as an exemplar or as a generative metaphor for the new proposal. And 2, as the inquirer reflects on similarities perceived, he formulates new hypotheses. But he also tests these hypotheses by experimental actions, which also function as moves for shaping the situation and a probe to continue to explore it. Just as we move through scheme after scheme and test a sequence of ideas in the design process on paper and through models, both in the computer and three-dimensionally, so too through the act of building, the actual act of building we learn. Candidly, our work is always an experiment. We don't tell our clients that, but it's the truth. No one ever built that there ever before on this day. It's an experiment. Full-size mock-up. Now, we talk about feedback loops. These occur when we pay attention and we push ahead onto the new project, improving upon what we learned from the last one or two. Let me illustrate this with almost a kind of simple-minded, banal example, a series of just benches or seating, rather mundane topic to most people, I would suppose. Well, at Columbus Circle, which you see in the lower slides there was a need for benches of a scale that we'd made earlier at Wagner Park that you see in the upper left at Battery Park City. But they had to be curved, not straight, to work with the other elements of that space. Now, I couldn't imagine how to curve ipe, a very dense tropical hardwood that cannot be laminated due to the oils that it has. So the wood members we ended up doing them in a radial manner. You see, we built this thing out in Wisconsin for Columbus Circle, the way the world works today. And so the wood members ended up in a radial manner because I couldn't figure out how to bend them. It seemed impossible. But at the same time, I was also experimenting with similar benches of Georgia marble at the Washington Monument grounds. And the form there seemed so much nicer with this smooth, continuous shape. This line of thought, which treated traditional building materials what was going on was we were thinking of traditional building materials metaphorically in terms of the kind of as if they were cushions, as if they were made of fabric, like pillows. But they weren't. They were wood, they were stone, they were something else. And so at a certain point, one of my partners had this other idea, following along on that metaphor. And this is when we got into the bubble benches that are these kind of plastic, well, they are kind of plastic. We didn't know whether they could be made of glass or plastic, but we thought if we put inert gas in them and all these other things, and people could sit on them. These were for a commercial area in the Caribbean near a cinema and some shops where people would be there at night, and we wanted some pedestrian lighting, and we wanted some kind of casual, fun stuff that didn't really compete with the commerce and wasn't just the same old dopey benches. And so, hence the bubble bench. Funny things happen when you take a metaphor and you begin to see where else it'll go. Now, following on that, what happened was one of my other partners was working down at Battery Park City, the Museum of Jewish Heritage, and had to do crash barriers, and like we had done at the Washington Monument, said, how can I turn those into something that's actually a civic good? And hit upon the idea of disguising them as benches with the steel frame as in the bench. And then, well, it's nice to sit on wood because you don't want to sit on a steel frame. And then, gee, it's a pedestrian area. The bubble bench showed us we could actually have the benches be the lights of the pedestrian area. So one thing after another comes along. You're working back and forth, and you're building things, and you're learning, and you're building full-size mock-ups in the office and testing them out with people of different sizes. And so it's like, this is the real thing. This is research. You're building it, and you're learning from it, and you're building more. And so by the time we got to Portland at Director Park, we found a boat builder in the Pacific Northwest who figured out how to bend ipe, because they've been building airframes and boats and stuff. And so I figured out how to get the curves that I couldn't get. The upper slide is at Columbus Circle. The lower slide is Director Park in Portland. And it's even more beautiful, more smooth. It's just, the idea that you are learning from yourself and your experiments, and you're continuing to push and push through practice. Well, that's enough of that. Practice evolves continuously in other ways, some of which does have to do with our tools and does have to do with the medium. Everybody talks about how the medium influences you and all that. Well, and this stuff feeds back into the academy. What goes on in practice, I do believe, does come back into the academy more than the other way around. In late 1990, as Barcelona was preparing for the 1992 Olympics, Bruce Graham of SOM in Chicago rounded up a bunch of people, architects mostly, to produce a new hotel and a commercial complex on the waterfront there. And SOM had been working with computers heavily for a number of years, partly as an experiment they were doing with IBM and various software companies. And they convinced both Frank Gehry and myself that we had to do so too. So Frank, of course, was like totally frustrated with the programs that were available to architects at that time in America. But one of his partners pointed out that the aerospace industry hadn't been using two-dimensional drawings or paper plans for years in the design of their productions of those sophisticated flying machines. So he got a hold of the CATIA program that had been developed by the French firm Dassault that they had modeled the Mirage jet fighter planes with. And this is the fish at Barcelona was the first time Frank's office ever used that program and began modeling in 3D. Now, Frank used it, in this case, to produce this great sunshade. It's a ramada or a pergola of sorts, but it's in the form of a fish. and as we were working together, I developed a large water basin below it with a mass of plane trees and willows such as you find beside the rios or the rivers in Spain. And in the sketch I did in a hotel one night when we were working together, I pointed out that his fish was going to float upon the waves of the trees, but that it also reminded me of a conquistador's helmet or of those funny wimple things that some of those nuns have in parts of Europe. And it was the kind of goofy associations you make with these things. Well, this was the first project that our office ever produced construction documents totally digitally at all. And the world was changing. But even though we had new tools, we were still trying, we're still going after the same old search for poetry through the medium, despite the changes in the tools. And the other thing to say about this is that the use of computers has totally changed your schools, it's changed our office, it's changed everybody. But at the same time, one of the things it's allowed us to do, one of the great things, is that Frank's office realized how they could use the computer to just send the instructions directly to the fabricators, cut out everybody else in the shop drawings and everything in between, and they could handle the logistics of construction just directly. The architectural offices that we work with today all do this sort of thing, and they know a tremendous amount about technology and construction and materials and processes. And these window modules, they came straight from the factory, directly from the architect's digital model without need of any shop drawings or traditional plans. It's shipped directly, installed, plugged right in. Now that's kind of history now. That was behind us, and we keep moving along. Now, another thing to note today is that one of the things we're interested in is how places and things we make look and feel. We always have been, but with these new tools, how do they help us? What can happen? And I would say that is another one of the contributions. We're trying to find out what are the possibilities of these spaces we can make, these new shapes, these new forms, the new structures we can put together. The feelings we can get are different because we have tools that allow us to do other things. Well, you know about that, but I just want to point out that it keeps changing. Now, let's move on. Another thing to note about praxis today is that one of the things we're interested in is larger environmental problems. I think we always were, those of us who were thoughtful. But fundamental concerns regarding sites, regardless of their location, are, the problems can be similar, but the locations constantly come out to be differently. And there is a nearly universal understanding that this is important. That one of the biggest problems facing the world, I think every professional now understands, has to do with water management, particularly rain and stormwater. This is a big chunk of the Yale campus, you see, or Science Hill. And virtually every project that we undertake today has a performative aspect regarding water. Some of the systems are simple, some of them are complex. Many of them are rather hybrid, but nearly all catch, clean, use, and reuse the water that's available from whatever annual rainfall the region can produce. Now, this group in this room today is not a group that needs hectoring about the need for environmental planning, especially with the recent example of Hurricane Sandy, to remind us. But for decades, my office and our peers have been helping our clients understand the relationship between their environments and natural systems. This example from Yale was part of a study done for the Science Hill, as I said, and it was largely to improve the quality of life there, but it was also about service. It was about how to add several million square feet of new, desperately needed science facilities. It was about how to handle things that had to do with economies of scale, finance, purchasing of water, sewage fees, etc. These are all important things. And so whether you work from, the top down or the bottom up in scale, ultimately one must work with incremental areas that catch and exploit water from discrete sites and building roofs, as we have here in this particular example at Croon Hall at Yale, a project where the rainwater is used for irrigation and toilet flushing, which is our common trick these days, employing a system that's actually going to pay for itself in a few years with the cost savings for water purchase and sewage rights. Now, what these systems look like and feel like is subject to the imagination of the designer. And a lot of people, when we start talking about water management, our clients get very nervous because they think we're going to give them a swamp, and they don't want something that looks like a mess. And the thing we keep telling them is nature doesn't care how it looks, it cares how it works. I mean, it does care how it looks when it's into sex, but not when it's into water management. That's another story. Anyway, but it's important to think about that these are, what you're looking at here is a water scrubbing basin on the roof of a service area next to an academic building. It's kind of doing a lot of work. For an extensive project on the West Coast right now, where we propose to create many acres of several different native communities of grasses, we are at this moment developing a series of test plots with the help of some horticulturalists, grassland experts, and growers. And while we're all familiar with sod farms that produce carpets of Kentucky bluegrass and a number of related fescues, no one in the world has ever been able to produce commercially or otherwise turf that is composed of native grasses such as grow along the coast of California in the form that could be easily picked up, moved, and put back down. Now, there's a number of reasons, and we think we know what they are. We've been studying it with our consultants for a while, and we believe that we've actually figured out how it might be possible to do this. And so we are, if it fails, we know what the fallback is. We'll use the combination of plugs, cuttings, and we'll overseed it with different mixes, et cetera, like we have been doing to create natural grass systems and that sort of thing for the past 20 years. But in this particular case, we think we've figured out how to go further and do this carpet technique with native sods. I think it would be very interesting. But this is in practice. We're not doing this at school. We're doing this for a job. And in considering such aspects of practice, I think you can see that one of the things I've been going through is we've been in different places. I've been moving from place to place, and so let's talk about place for a few minutes. Alexander Pope, in his lengthy epistle to Lord Burlington, it was written in tetrameter couplets, certainly a tour de force in the genre of aesthetic advice to a patron. One of the things he says in it, his own translation from Virgil, consult the genius of the place in all. You've all heard the phrase before, and I'll repeat it. Consult the genius of the place in all. Well, the notion then as today was that there is some sort of spirit or character present for each and every particular location on the globe, and that one needs to be somehow conscious of the forces of environmental conditions when imposing change in order to be successful. To ignore the genius loci was and still is to court trouble. So when I was putting this talk together, I chose these particular sketches of mine to make the point that people in the past, such as in Alaska where I grew up, were actually aware of nature and their relationship to it. They were acutely aware of it all the time. There was a kind of informed humility, but in the continually urbanizing world of today, many otherwise educated people have a strange attitude to nature as if it's somehow other and it's out there, and that they are somehow separate from nature. Now, nothing, as we understand, could be further from the truth. We are in nature all the time, all day, every day. We're part of nature. In fact, we need it, but I don't think it particularly needs us. The world is dynamic, as you saw, and as the people living in Fukushima or New Orleans or on the Atlantic seaboard in North America this past week are very well aware. But that said, for many of us practitioners, today, in addition to coming to terms with nature and the absolute facts of geography, a climate, a major aspect of place, or the other big consideration of the genius loci, I believe, happens to be culture, the society and the heritage of the locus of activity. In an era when many of us find ourselves working in disparate places around the globe or different continents and in different cultures, the vastly different histories and stages of development of economics and government, the issues encompassed by the notion of place, I think, need to be responded to in a mature manner, not just with mechanical equipment and cliched decor or debased cartoon regionalism. The issues raised years ago by Ken Frampton in his essays on critical regionalism seem to have fallen on deaf ears in the offices of a number of leading design firms working across the United States, Europe, Asia, and Latin America. On visits to architectural schools across the country, I can still find a surprising number of students and faculty working with blank slate sites that are all to all intents and purposes are flat white rectangles devoid of reality. The fascination with form and parametrics has once again trumped engagement with social behavior and the nuance and messiness of actual place. This is more than being tone deaf to ecology, which LEED and sustainability and sustainable sites and BREEAM and these initiatives have attempted to combat. But they also demonstrate a particular lack of curiosity and respect for their responsibilities regarding the richness, diversity, and difficulties presented by the dilemmas of individuals and groups in particular places. Now, in practice, there are two aspects of the idea of place. The first is to understand the particular nature of a given place, to understand its merits and unique aspects, which is precious, and what's precious and what isn't, before you attempt to add, subtract, or transform anything about it. And then the second concept of place is the notion that you could actually make a place that didn't exist before, that has properties that make sense where you are and that is valued by people. I think one must be careful not to make the mistake of thinking that any and every old thing is worthy, which is a problem some of my colleagues have, any more than everything that is new is good. One of the things I learned from two of my mentors, one was a poet and the other was an architect, was a concern the concern and admiration for superb works of the past and a passion for modernity are not antithetical. Preservation and modernism in contemporary design pose no real conflict for thoughtful and creative designers, in my view. Just look at the work of Carlos Scarpa in Venice and Verona, or look at the Mediatek in Orange by Norman Foster across from facing the Maison Carré in Nîmes, to know that this is true. Now, certainly, our work in New York has attempted to honor the character and the spirit of that city. Whether it was the transformation of Bryant Park from a dangerous outdoor drug market into a much used and lush gathering place for New Yorkers and visitors, or our work at Columbus Circle or at Battery Park City, there has been a conscious attempt to honor the work of earlier designers through the continuity and use of particular materials and furnishings that we found that were in many of the successful spaces. In a sense, we attempted to extend the building fabric and the ideas of the city, much as the plan that we developed with Alex Cooper at Battery Park City abandoned the earlier notions of large megastructures and futuristic proposals that had little to do with the adjacent metropolis. We looked at the DNA of Manhattan and concluded that we should build more of the city in like kind. But the grid that we chose to do wasn't just parallel to the Hudson River. We kind of bent it so that all the streets led down to the water, so you knew where you were always when you stepped onto the street, there it was. That's not the way the rest of the island works. So it was like Manhattan, but it was an addition to it. And then we produced a space where you could step out into the corridor of the Hudson River and be there which you could do almost nowhere in the city at that point, except for a couple of little parks up at Riverside Drive and the Battery itself. Now, this move in 1979 subsequently has led the city to reclaim a vast portion of the waterfront for public use, further enriching the quality of life and reinforcing the island. And this is a place that never existed, and there it is, and it feels like New York. Now, in addition to being thoughtful about the existing and underlying character of a place, one can, with care and thought, I think, create new places that are not characteristic and generic, but which have specific and unique qualities and that have their own positive identity. I think this is the case at Columbus Circle, a place that for several generations has been an unpleasant and somewhat dysfunctional and dangerous intersection. This memorial to a mariner, the namesake, was hopelessly lost in a sea of traffic and parking. It certainly wasn't a place of safety that anyone would choose to venture. Now, Bob Hanna and I had the notion back in the 1980s to return it to a true circle and make a place with trees and water. And although the story is a long and interesting one, at least to me, I will summarize to say that finally in the waning years of the Giuliani administration, waning days actually, I was asked to see if we could accomplish this. And with the assistance of a brilliant traffic engineer who sorted out the circulation and movement of the pedestrians and vehicles so it actually could be a circle, we were able to create a new place that has even surprised New Yorkers, a very tough crowd. I have to say they are. But they've taken it up, and they can be found there day and night in this place that never existed before. And to my delight, not too long ago, I opened the New Yorker one day to find a drawing, this particular drawing advertising one of their events, that was of a place that didn't even exist a year before, and that they were using it as an image of themselves in the city. It couldn't have pleased me more about, did I hit that nerve with them? Was it them? Now, I can't really give any rules for this activity. I think it's, to a large degree, it's something that Roger Transek talked about in the title of his book, Finding Lost Space, which was devoted to a discussion of the post-war town planning, urban renewal, and some of the most egregious architecture of the era, and the various strategies and projects that he sought and others have sought to repair the situation. Another one of our projects like this, like the Columbus Circle in a way, different, that was conceived in this vein was the transformation of a jumble of relic buildings and streets in the center of Seattle into a civic piazza such as one would, not produce anywhere else, but would be right there. Now, while the city is surrounded by spectacular scenery, mountains, water, forests, and lush neighborhoods with parks and gardens, there was nowhere in the center of the city for gathering, whether it be for charitable fundraisers, community festivals, or to celebrate if their sports teams would ever win anything. The plaza we developed there was conceived to look, one of our fundamental ideas was that we wanted to look better wet than dry, something that a native of the rainy Northwest would understand. We also wanted it to be well built in such a way that it would be durable and strong and tough. And part of our idea was we'd make it out of granite blocks, polychrome granite, and the structure of the paving would become its own ornament, and the pattern of it is derived from a fabric, that of the woven basket by this particular one I found in the Burke Museum in Seattle, of the Salish Indians, the people who lived there first. Now, this is not a strategy that you would or could employ just anywhere. It's unique to its time, to its place, to where it is, to what we're thinking about those years, and to that city and that climate. But it made a place like no other, and one that belongs only in Seattle. And some of them just hate it, and some of them love it, and some of them don't even notice it. But it's there, and it'll be there for a good while. Well, at times in the process of design, one makes decisions that are based upon personal or private thoughts, like I just said, and motives that ultimately are designs, they really have to work for others. They're not really for ourselves, finally, regardless of whatever references or cultural clues we may think we've invested them with. And the competition that I did with Peter Eisenman that we won back in 1984 for a new visual arts center at Ohio State University was very controversial at the time, still causes wisecracks and unfriendly remarks from some, despite the appreciation and affection from others. But unique as it is, It is deeply grounded, however, in the region and the locale. The scheme that we developed began with that old chestnut, the Jeffersonian survey grid, that covers so much of the United States, and especially is dominant in the Ohio farm landscape. I did a drawing for Sybil Mahoney-Nagy of the Ohio grid for her book Matrix of Man back in the 60s. So it's the kind of thing that had been on our minds for a while, and Peter was kind of in one of his grid moods. But one of the things about it is that gave us the start, but he did this weird thing of invoking the memory of a Victorian armory that had once stood on the site and had been blown up, a real act of deconstruction. Well, I covered most of the site, including portions of the building, with this kind of tall prairie grasses, which were a memory of what had been there and is equally long gone. Now, they're not really real prairie grasses. It's just a kind of to evoke the prairie, because you couldn't do a real prairie here. It's kind of silly. But the notion of this echo of something, it was something that we were very interested in. It's not a restoration, it's not copying, but we were producing an abstract composition where we explored the interests we had of conceiving of building in terms of landscape and landscape in terms of building, vice versa. This figure ground thing was just driving us nuts. And it's something that we now have probably one of our last grand projects together is nearing completion at Santiago de Compostela in Spain, which is that same idea writ large. Now, another project that we did together, the Memorial to the Murdered Jews of Europe, is also a work that has created a unique place in a particular city. Although it was begun by Peter with Richard Serra, I joined them after they needed a little help, and they called and they said if I could help them figure out actually how to achieve it and build it. And we began working with Burrow Happold, the fabulous engineers, to sort out the construction and some of the issues of Berlin in that particular case. And also I was asked to help them convince the German committee from the Bundestag that we weren't going to produce something that was so horrible that bad things would happen in it and they would all be embarrassed, and that it wouldn't be flooded and that sort of thing. And in the sketch study, my sketch in the upper left there, you can see that part of what we were trying to figure out, at least I was trying to figure out at that time, was how to actually have it grow out of the typical fabric of the mandated sort of pavements and streets and stuff that the city planners in Berlin were kind of putting, spreading like mayonnaise all over the city, this kind of these typical details, which actually are very good details, very solid details, but how we could have that morph from the thing across from the Tiergarten morph into our surfaces and begin to work with that. Well, anyway, the subtleties of material and of detail on the one hand, and this bold and terrifying imagery on the other, that ground that particular Berlin memorial, it could be no other place. It could be in no other country, city, time, or place. It's unique to that project. There are other, less difficult strategies and cases of projects that are much more easily accessible, of course, and clearly identifiable, that both create a new place and very much belong to one at the same time. Such situations often turn to the underlying background ecology of a region and employ aspects of it in a very clear manner to make a new place, albeit a contextual place. At this enormous conference center for the LDS Church in Salt Lake City, we worked, our office worked with ZGF from Portland, Bob Frasca's firm, to find a way to make a structure big enough to house 747s in its main auditorium, you might say. The pilgrims from all around the world at these semi-annual conferences, plus the Mormon Tabernacle Choir and the church hierarchy and all that. And we needed to figure out how to take that jumbo building and have it settle into place in the city without being grotesque. And part of the conclusion was to have it become a landscape as much or more than it was a building. The main roof of it, the entire project is over structure. Even what you think is the ground is over subterranean structure. The main roof is 6 acres in size, 4 acres of which we created a subalpine meadow, such as one finds up in the nearby Wasatch Range of the Rocky Mountains. The sides and the backs of the hall are clothed, as you saw in those first slides, in vegetation from the canyons nearby where the granite for the building comes from, up in Little Cottonwood Creek. Well, inside is this spectacular hall, with perfect sight lines for 25,000 people, more than watch the Denver Jazz in their building down the street. And a better building, too. But the church volunteers, under the direction of my partner, Susan Weiler, planted hundreds of thousands of grasses, forbs, herbs, which we had contract grown specifically for the job up there on the roof. It's a dramatic example of that ancient idea of Rus in urbs, which is executed in a manner not too dissimilar from that of the ancient Romans, and some of the work that I admire from the first century there. And with the hawks hunting meadow mice by day and owls pursuing rabbits at night, it is literally a case of what Walpole referred to in his essay praising an early landscape gardener, William Kent, when he talked about calling the country in. Recently, I read something about Antoine Dvorak, that he once remarked that a composer must prick up his ear to every sound, and that after his 3 years of residence in America, he found in subsequent compositions good use for a number of things that he'd heard while he was here. It's also true as well that designers need to learn to see and be constantly aware of the world around them, noting things of interest as they move about the world. And that architects and landscape architects, I think it's imperative, as I said earlier, that they go out and see the world and the places where they're working as well. An interesting case in point, I'd say, of this is the so-called Fred and Ginger building that Frank Gehry did in Prague. Now, while there are many signature characteristics of Frank's in the work, it's also deeply contextual without resorting to imitation or cliché. Making use of prefabricated window units, stucco, and moldings, his new structure picks up the scale and texture of the historic neighbors, extends the street wall very harmoniously, and then the slightly woozy glass element that's anthropomorphically referred to as ginger is a very clear derivative of numerous corner towers throughout the old city. And the jutting bracketed balcony, the patterning of the windows, the wavy stucco reveals speak directly to the graphic quality of the many Baroque and Rococo facades throughout the city. Frank wouldn't and hasn't done another building quite like it anywhere. It was, I would say, sensitively developed for Prague and just for this site. Now, one can respond to the particularities of place in any number of ways that are not cliché. A recent project of ours, again with Bob Frasca's firm in Portland, was to develop a small urban park. The site was tiny. It was 100 feet by 200 feet, believe it or not, half a Portland city block. What the attributes of a contemporary urban park should be, of course, is something very much of debate in our field and around the world today. And in the case of Portland, like Seattle, it is blessed with verdant region, parks and neighborhoods that are the envy of other cities. It also has bold fountains, things like Larry Halpern did, superb transit, handsome architecture, often with a local flavor. So I concluded that the one thing it didn't have, there was a nice downtown place that was more intimate than their Pioneer Courthouse Square, that one could sit outdoors and have coffee while you're reading and socializing, quintessential activities there. On those days when it's slightly misty or drizzling, because in the Northwest, the temperature is often mild all year round and pleasant, but it's kind of damp. And the idea that one could just borrow almost from the 19th century train stations, this simple idea that you could have a park with some pavement, a few plants, small fountain, intimate stuff, and that you'd have shelter and you could be outdoors and see and be seen and like one would like to do, even in their climate. Well, the canopy that we did became an armature for a Seattle artist, Dan Corson, who works with light, and he created a work that is done with sort of strips of digital images that come from natural phenomena of light on rippling waters and leaves and grasses moving in the breeze and stuff like that. It's quite wonderful to be there. People go there and just kind of hang out at night and have coffee and look at the funny light thing going on overhead and its reflections in the water. And to counteract its diminutive size and to make it, give it some amplitude and also a certain amount of its being more important than some other things like moving automobiles around, we decided to extend the pavement to the sides, across the streets, to the left and right, to the east and west, basically making it so that cars, when they drive through the square, know they're going through a pedestrian area and they're sort of disciplined by all those people and all those textures and that noise. And it's Very simple ideas, but it is totally about Portland, and it's very much a Portland place. It is local. Maybe in London we'd do something similar, but it would come out differently. It would have a different accent, I know. Now, the final example of this concern for locale and place is our competition-winning scheme for the new United States Embassy in London, for which we are currently in the process of completing construction drawings at the moment, with Kieran Timberlake, the architects from Philadelphia, who are also on our faculty at Penn, have developed a building that is absolutely tailored to its London environment. The long pursuit of energy strategies and sustainability practices for which their office is celebrated is not only smart economically, something not lost on the gimlet-eyed types in the State Department client group, but it has helped them to produce a building that is crafted to its site and climate. After studying building volumetrics and orientation that would optimize a surface for solar gain. This is all done during the competition, but these were versions trying to get the project that we ended up presenting. Well, they were trying to optimize a surface for solar gain, and they developed a scrim for 3 of the facades that would produce the maximum energy while offering shade at certain times and views at all times. Our office, in turn, was working with Arup's office, and out of London and New York, and wonderful engineers, as you know. And we were trying to make sure that the site also became part of the mechanical system of the building, but also that it catches the ample and rather regular rainfall. It reuses it, and while deploying it as a pond that functions in part as a little bit of the energy device and system for the building, as you see here, but also as part of the security systems for the building. And also it has aquatic plants that assist in scrubbing the water, and it offers habitat and visual and acoustic amenity to those in the new community that is coming around, that's going to be developed around us, that is being attracted to this basic park that we're building with an embassy in the middle of it. And along 9 Elms Lane there on the Thames River on the south bank of London. So currently, it also appears that this building will be sending its surplus energy back into the local power authority rather than the other way around. Now, this is taking a little too long, I'm sorry, but I'm going to say a few more words about teaching because it has to do with all of the above, I think, everything I've been talking about. What I was going to say is, at Penn, we are deeply concerned in issues that have to do with place, and the ecological issues I mentioned before, but also with the history and involvement of research and practice. Unlike other elderly institutions like Harvard and Yale, which began life as divinity schools and to a degree retained their powerful humanities underpinning, Penn, which was founded by Ben Franklin and is the oldest university in the country, is a Quaker endeavor, and it began as an institution centered around science, technology, and the practical arts, and the spirit of that still flows in its veins. Our department was resuscitated from its closure during World War II by the powerful and influential figure of Ian McHarg, whose insight and effort both within the school and throughout the world, the work of the firm rather, that he founded with another member of the planning faculty, David Wallace, had a significant impact upon the field of landscape architecture, environmental planning, and regulation in this country and the world. Despite his early training in art and design in Scotland and Harvard's Graduate School of Design, Ian was impatient with what he perceived as the soft intellectual nature of architecture and landscape architecture in the late 1950s and 60s. He was partly inspired by the natural sciences and partly by an interest in formal, quantitative, process-driven models of analysis coming out of the wartime operations of naval research. Ian set about experimenting with his students and employees with what we still refer to as the overlay method, which you see some examples from his first great book here, which were developed for regional and large-scale site planning. And by the time I arrived at Penn in 1974, he had built a faculty of natural and social sciences with research grant funding from the Ford Foundation and the National Institute of Mental Health, as well as a handful of private patrons. These factor maps are from an independent studio that I directed at that time, as we were pioneering ecological planning, overlay mapping, water quality management, natural treatment systems, and various related diagnostic and predictive processes now considered normative around the world. All of this was done by hand, often painfully, while consuming enormous blocks of time. It was only a few years later that the introduction of computers, which was taking place in the studio and was going on at that point up at Harvard and at MIT, but without any of our data. We had the data and they had the machines. It was kind of crazy. But within our department and the field through the 1970s and the 80s, there was also dissension and continues to be grumbling about a perceived gap between the utility and this utilitarian and positive technical rationality of the models and the methods that were developed and the needs of those actively engaged in practice. These concerns have centered upon social and artistic issues and dilemmas of scale and the quality and and suitability of the data. For all of the desire on the part of many, not just Ian, to produce a foolproof scientific basis for planning, our social scientists then and now continue to resist what are perceived as determinist and overly generalist attempts to employ social data. There was a sense on our part, and that of the scientists that we worked with, that too often people were treated as abstract groups with statistical characteristics, not as individuals with the character and quirky families and communities that they indeed are. The abstractions and sweeping categorizations that have underlain so much trouble of the 20th century, concepts such as the masses, the working class, ethnicities, races, these dehumanizing groupings, have led to a deep resistance for extending some of our most useful rational methods for prescriptive purposes beyond bio and geophysical matters. Likewise, the ubiquitous use of computers and digital media has not diminished the need for our students to learn to see and gain not just information and data, but experience and knowledge, feeling, and understanding of the world and other people through time-tested methods such as this one you see here. While it may seem as an added burden, the current situation has not stalled our efforts, certainly, to advance the fields and our methods, but it has caused us to consider the combinations and processes of techniques that work best, regardless of how old or new they may be. The endeavor is to help prepare our students for engagement in practice, research, and possibly teaching, to give them as full an appreciation for the scope and nature of the field and some working habits that will allow and encourage them to be able to grow and to continue to develop on their own after they depart. Continue to grow. That's part of the problem that we're trying to deal with, how they should do that. Well, one of our firm beliefs has been to offer studios in provocative places with real, often perplexing problems as experiments and to invite members of the community in for engagement with the students and their proposals. These images are from a collaborative studio that I did with urban design and Joe Passano when I was at the GSD in 1986. We asked the students to examine vehicular and pedestrian movement and facilities in downtown Boston, and then to speculate upon what urban improvements might be leveraged by interfering or altering or changing aspects of the situation of whatever nature and scope they could imagine. A number of remarkable and praiseworthy urban improvements emerged. One that I show here, as you see in the lower right, interestingly enough, and a praiseworthy one, that one put the Callahan Elevated Expressway below grade and developed a set of parks and new structures on top of it. Another proposed connecting the Mass Turnpike to the airport with a new harbor bridge, which became a tunnel, of course. Others recognized aspects of surface traffic, creating several new urban spaces near Chinatown and South Boston. Among the guest jurors that we brought in was Fred Salvucci, a transportation official of the city, who was later to become Transportation Secretary of the Commonwealth. Good ideas have a life of their own, and this is a case where one can see almost the exact plan as it happened more than a decade later in this student project. As at many of our institutions today, we are blessed with students from different parts of the world, the majority of whom will return to their native country, often with a climate history and current economic and political framework considerably different from that of Philadelphia or the United States. How to give them tools and methods that will allow them to do successful work under what will be markedly different conditions from where they are studying is one of our concerns, especially since we insist upon site specificity as a basis for worthy design. My response has been to try to base every studio somewhere all the recent ones, somewhere foreign enough to all or most of the students, and then to take them through a sequence of steps and events that they might employ anywhere that will inevitably produce different results that grow out of the people and place where they find themselves. It's a simple idea of immersion and of having them work in a place where they can't really rely upon unexamined assumptions that they have about familiar territory, for instance, the United States or China or wherever they're from. They have to put out their antenna and make a genuine effort to understand what is going on before they propose to interfere as designers. 9 years ago, I began a 3-year period wherein several colleagues and I took a collaborative studio of architects and landscape architects to northwest China each spring term, using the Department of Landscape Architecture that I'd helped found at Tsinghua University in Beijing as our base of operations. There we were joined by several faculty and students from architecture, landscape architecture, and urban design. Working together in teams, the students combined their original field study and mapping of conditions of actual social usage of urban space with literature searches and conventional information and data gathering, analysis and synthesis to produce projects of their own devising. The students were exposed to contemporary designers and to several of the country's leading figures in design and planning, such as Professor Wu Liangyang, who you see in this photograph in the lower right, who shared their thought, their sympathy, and their great criticism. Our field trips are only a portion of the studio and their activity, although they are at its very heart. These studios always begin with a place that has one or more serious environmental and social problems that are not particularly unique. After the China studios, for the next 3 years, our studios went to a small former Iron Curtain town on the border of the Czech Republic. The Czech Republic and Austria. Part of the point in each place is that however unique they are, they will have these issues that are germane to people around the world. At Slavnica, the legacy of centuries of war and 40 years of the Iron Curtain had left serious problems in what looks like a picture postcard town, but was really a very much struggling community. On the assumption that the prepared mind is a fertile one, and that one should never begin working on a problem prior to knowing as much as possible about the situation, we embark for a few weeks upon research regarding the place, its nature, its history, its people, its issues. We work in teams for a while, and they tackle a litany of traditional natural factors: geology, soil, surface, subsurface hydrology, topography, climate, ecology. But then we try to look as deeply as we can from afar at the social topics, their economic history, their governance, their history of their art, their architectural heritage, their literature. And for each studio, there are also special areas of concern that the students develop after we've begun to work. All of this amounts to a crash course in the place that we happen to be going to work. My colleagues, and these are almost always joint studios with students from architecture and landscape architecture, and occasionally a few come in from historic preservation and city planning when we can get them. And I have students, they work first on individual things for themselves, and then they work in small groups, and then they work in larger groups, and then they work in individual work again. They work on a series of, first we give them some exercises to limber them up, loosen them up, see what they can do. And first we have them create a small personal shelter, real old-fashioned basic thing, like, what, you're in a desert, make a place for yourself, sort of thing. And then we got 2 days to do it, and let's have a review, and then we move on. And then we have them do a camp for a group on their site, and then we finally give them a chunk of housing for a group of families, and we keep moving the scale up and trying to get them to focus on more and more difficult issues and interaction of issues before we take off. And then we go to the place, and what happens is we travel to the site over spring break for 10 days. There's an intense trip with visits to historic and exemplary design in places. We range from vernacular work to the most brilliant contemporary work that we can find, or in this case you see in the upper right, to Mies van der Rohe's Tugendhat Villa in Brno, and other things we saw in Prague later. We have lectures, we have site visits from local professionals and scholars, extensive examination of the site combined with meetings. We did our own survey by hand in the snow one year at Slavnica. I had to teach them how to run levels. It was just because the survey was so bad. Later we got some good Russian military maps that someone found on the web. The students are amazing. Anyway, after several days of intense workshop and charrette, the students then make a presentation. They work with the community, and then they make a presentation to the community, to its leaders, to the mayor, everybody, the local professionals. And after receiving the feedback, a big celebratory party, and then the next day we go home, we pick up the pieces, and we go back to work. Now, using this field-based method and these proposals and the critiques that they've received, we then use that as a starting point for the students to do a very intense project the rest of the term, developing something in depth. Again, with a major review and critique at the end, and when we can, we bring members of the original community in for that final review. It's intense, it's enormously rewarding, and we try not to tell the students what to do, but try to use the Socratic method, which is very difficult for students trained in some other countries, especially in Asia, to get that way to operate. But they get it. They get it. It takes them usually several weeks or longer. But we continually question their goals and their methods, their purpose, their reasons, their feelings, and their assumptions. And obviously, we try to help them with technical things. But again, we try to send them off to find the answers. We try to help them learn how to work independently of their instructor or of any prescribed solution. 2 years ago, we shifted the studio to New Mexico in the desert Southwest and began working with problems of communities there. The first one we engaged was another borderlands project, that in the lower Rio Grande Valley, and the dilemmas of the agricultural workers there in a neighboring Mexico. Last year, we set the studio within the Santo Domingo Pueblo, halfway between Santa Fe and Albuquerque, working with the tribal elders, their chief planner, and a group of their high school students from the Indian School in Santa Fe, and a number of local professionals, historians, and academics. And while this site is closer to home, it was as foreign and interesting to most of the American students as it was to those from abroad. The issues of health, poverty, economic difficulty, combined with those of an arid, harsh, yet fragile landscape, and a culture striving to retain its heritage and identity in the face of modern global forces, are not unique to American Indians, but can actually be found in other communities and countries all around the world, several of which are among the most contentious and troubled today. The need for housing, sustainable employment, resource management, and an environment that supports a healthy community are global problems. Our studios focus upon these issues and ask our students to explore what role their design, imagination, and production can play in addressing them. I remember Jerry McHugh once telling the GSD faculty at Harvard that the law school doesn't teach students every law and every case that ever happened or might occur. Rather, they teach them how to think like lawyers, to be prepared to work on new situations every day. He said, we can't teach young people about every design solution in history or tell them how to solve the myriad problems they'll face. But we can try to prepare them to think like architects and be prepared to work thoughtfully and effectively wherever they end up. The student work from last year's Santo Domingo studio is very particular to the people and the place of that particular community. Yet the processes of thinking, proposing, testing ideas, and solutions for their problems seems a useful one to begin with wherever one is to work. Different factors will prove more or less important in different sites, wherever you are. Sometimes the geology is more important. Sometimes it's the family structure. Sometimes it's, water. Some things are, all things are not equal, but you've got to figure out, you have to look at them all and check them out and see how they interrelate. Certainly, the solutions developed should end up particular to a place, despite what problems are common or generic. Well, Steve Jobs once said to me, most architects are dopes. It was a kind of pointed jab at our profession, I think at me at the time. And I replied, so are most engineers and dentists. So while he was right that most of us aren't intellectuals, and that many people and many professionals coast along getting by with the state of the art and with their habits of mind, in his own work and career, Steve nurtured a climate of intense collaboration and exploration. His company became renowned for the intensity of its research and its development and its testing and its pushing and its pushing and its trying. But also, Steve talked about the fact that good design is not a mere application of data, information, and technology, but also involved other aspects of human awareness, feeling, and interaction. If ever there was a person who valued the phenomenon of beauty, spirit, and play, and the intuition and the elegance of intuition when things click, It was Steve. Good design is clearly more than applied science. At its best, it will always remain an art. That many projects and problems facing the design professions today require a serious amount of technical knowledge and research is indisputable, and that this information is in a continual state of growth and evolution. It is also a fact that no one individual or profession can know enough or spend enough time on all the various aspects of the more complex problems facing us at almost any scale anymore alone. Collaboration between individuals and disciplines in practice, industry, and academia has become normal and is vital. At the same time, we must once and for all dispense with attitudes that treat the world as one of generality and uniformity. The days of thinking of sites as blank slates and our own culture and standards and habits as universally appropriate to impose everywhere are over. We need to learn the difference between product design and environmental design, between objects and architecture, between things that can in many ways and should be easy to use, even universal, and the unique situation of particular places and people, of climate, place, and heritage. While America espouses diversity in its populace and in numerous other ways, its design schools and professions have yet to move sufficiently past a cultural hegemony that still encourages imposing outmoded building types, transportation models, and resource consumption wherever commercial gain allows, whether at home or abroad, exporting the mess we have made for ourselves. The good news is that almost all of our students seem to know this. They know that it will soon be up to them to put into practice the values expressed so well by J.B. Jackson that I first read shortly after I entered practice. And that was that every person alive was entitled to an environment that is ecologically healthy, socially just, and spiritually rewarding. Thank you.